This is Let Me Sum Up, your annual deep dive into the goings-on at the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today in person at COP28 in Dubai. And I'm joined today by two co-hosts and one special guest. Global Vice President of Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, Luke, tenant and special guest. I also +1 with baby Muscovich as well.
Yes, that's true. Little baby Muscovich is with us in the background, and the star attraction of COP28. I think we're saying, Frankie, that the youngest delegate at COP28 that we've seen around the grounds.
I'm pretty sure she's the youngest person to hold a badge, judging by the reaction from the staff who took her photo for the badge that's now going to the pool room.
Presidents, Prime Ministers, King Charles, who cares?
And those are the dulcet tones of the unofficial food critic of the UNFCCC Conference of Parties, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
I've been having a ball. There's great food here, and people know it if they follow my Twitter.
And I'm delighted to welcome our special guest, Dr. Simon Evans, Deputy Editor and Senior Policy Editor at Carbon Brief, one of the leading global organisations reporting on the latest developments in climate science, climate policy and energy policy. Hello, Simon.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Do you have any idea what you've stumbled into?
In terms of the COP or this podcast?
This podcast.
The latter, no, definitely not. Although I'm getting an idea pretty quickly.
All will become horrifyingly clear.
All right. Well, on this week's show, we are eschewing the standard format so we can go long on week one of COP28 here in Dubai. We are recording on the 6th of December, and today marks the close of week one, so it is a great moment to pause and reflect on where we are at the halfway mark. But before we get into the blow by blow, every COP has its own character, and I'm interested to hear from each of you what you're finding around the place. What's the vibe? What has jumped out to you so far in this particular COP?
So what's jumped out to me is that despite the incredible scope of the thing, everything just kind of works. There's food around, there's water around, there's weird golf carts around, and the Wi-Fi is solid, and even though the security lines can be long, they move at a decent clip, and like implausibly vast numbers of people are meant to be here, and it's just like logistically humming along. So well done, UAE.
And that's the trick, right? Correct me, but it's like 80,000 folk in the blue zone, which is where the political negotiations and a lot of the observers are, and then
I've heard like 100,000,
okay.
But like who the heck knows for real?
I think it depends if you count like volunteers and technical staff and all of that.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
also like all of the people registered don't necessarily turn up.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is this site is absolutely vast, so who knows?
Yeah.
It doesn't feel crowded. I mean, like COP26 in Glasgow felt very, very crowded. That was like less than half the size. So it's such a big site, you kind of lose sight of people.
You could have an extra 10,000 people squirreled away in one of the other pedals and not know about it.
What about you, Frankie?
Well, I mean, I think that's what struck me the most, apart from Tennant's points about just a very well-run sort of logistics of the event. Given I have a small baby with me, it's been really great to know that there's accessible, facilities and things like that, and which wouldn't normally bear remarking, but last year's COP was vastly different in that respect, and I wouldn't have, I don't think I would have wanted a newborn with me in Sharm el-Sheikh, but here that's been good. I think the thing about the vastness of the venue here that's perhaps a bit of a downside compared to last year, when you consider the layout of the pavilions at Sharm. It felt like a giant trade show. So you had, each country with their little sort of setup. They could have been selling you air conditioners, but they were country pavilions. But it provided a lot more of that serendipity or chance to meet people, bumping into people, look at events as you were walking past and then go into them. Whereas here, it's a lot more siloed. Every country's pavilion is its own building. So when you're walking around all the common area or the public realm side of things, you don't really get a sense for what's going on because it's all behind closed doors. The other thing that struck me, and it goes to that attendance, apart from the numbers of people we were talking about as well, was also the nature of the people that are here. So I think, if you're 100,000+ people, this is, I think, the first year where they're publishing the full list of people who have been given badges. And that's prompting, I think, a lot more attention, from the media about the nature of people who are attending the COP. And I think the president, Sultan Al-Jaber, is a lightning rod for that in some sense. There's a lot of commentary around fossil fuel lobbyists and things like that.
Yeah. Simon, this is sort of your Super Bowl, like the annual conference of parties. You follow this space very closely. What stood out to you particularly about this COP as opposed to other ones that you've attended?
Yeah, I mean, definitely agree with what Frankie and Tennant said already. But, I mean, I think the thing that connects all of those is money, right? And specifically oil and gas money. So, we've seen from the start of the COP, just in terms of the venue, in terms of the quality of the facilities, everything's very new here. That's all obviously come with a huge amount of spending that the hosts have put into it. And we've seen them open their checkbook repeatedly in the opening days as they tried to kind of wow everyone with these big flashy announcements, contributing $100 million into the loss and damage fund. We'll probably get onto that in a minute. But, they've done that repeatedly. And at the same time, that's obviously... as Frankie said, that's caused a bit of a, let's say a close attention on the fact that Sultan Al-Jaber is also the head of the national oil company here, and I've heard from a number of people that the hosts are very, very sensitive and about the success of the COP, the perceived kind of success of the COP, but also specifically about how Al-Jaber himself is kind of perceived and his, the image, and they're clearly quite sensitive about all of that. And they've sort of been very, trying very, very hard. On that long list of attendees, there's absolutely millions of PR people that have been brought in by the presidency. But despite all their efforts, there have been a number of, very negative stories about things that Al-Jaber has said over the course of this year, which have obviously, knowing the newspapers and the BBC News story, they've been saving those up to land just around the COP for maximum attention, and they certainly have had lots of attention. So that's pretty striking. I think just one last thing on all of that. There was the story in the Guardian about Al-Jaber kind of saying there was no science behind phasing out all fossil fuels and various other stuff about if we phase out fossil fuels it will send us back to the Stone Age. And then the following day after that story came out, he held a presidency press briefing. One of my colleagues went along and she said it was just one of the most kind of bizarre and remarkable press conferences she'd ever seen. It was basically him for an hour trying to kind of justify and defend himself for all of the things he said. I mean, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that PR consultants would not have advised him to make those comments. And then afterwards, I mean, the way he went about kind of defending himself was, let's say, interesting.
And are you getting the sense that this controversy, this, Al-Jaber is a sort of a lightning rod for, discussion and debate about the appropriateness of him holding this role, and then the reaction against that? How is that playing out in terms of the actual dynamics of the COP? Do you think it's having a material impact on the progress that we're seeing here in Dubai?
Yeah, I think that's much harder to say. In a way, like watching the presidency as it's kind of developed over the course of this year, I feel like they've kind of walked themselves into a corner. So, like, obviously, straight away when it was announced that they were going to be the host and that Al-Jaber was going to be the president, immediately people clocked that his dual role as head of ADNOC and head of COP28 and said, like, this is crazy. How's that going to work? And he kind of got in trouble quite early on this year talking about, focusing on fossil fuel emissions rather than focusing on fossil fuels. And people were like, nah, that's no good. And then he kind of walked himself into this, language around fossil fuel phase out being inevitable and essential. And so he's obviously under pressure from a lot of directions. Not least from his own country, his own company, but obviously other petrostates that are neighbouring countries. But at the same time, he's kind of walked himself into this position where he's basically pushing for language on fossil fuels to be in the final text. So if that doesn't happen, and given how much store they're putting in this being seen as a successful COP, I think they're in quite a tricky spot, really.
And it's such a high degree of difficulty for an already difficult exercise, because there's incredible nuance involved in this fossil fuels issue. We'll come back to it, I'm sure. It's just very hard to command people's confidence in putting a nuanced position on that when you're the head of the national oil company. And something that would be like, well, that's an interesting point of view from an academic or a minister of a relatively disinterested party comes across very differently when it's coming from the head of ADNOC.
I think it's just worth mentioning that. I mean, obviously a lot of focus on the presidency, and that's been the case in, all of the recent COPs that I've been to, running right back to Paris. But it's fair to say that it's not all about the presidency. It's supposed to be a party-led process. Yep. And interestingly, this year, because of the way that the talks are organised, all of that discussion about fossil fuel phase-out is taking place not under the rule of the presidency, at least not this week. It's taking place, being led by the parties themselves. And so, like last year, we saw the Egyptian presidency refusing to put fossil fuels into the negotiating text because they were in control of that cover text decision. And so they were able to block that. This year, the UAE can't do that. Even if they hadn't been calling for fossil fuel language, they wouldn't have been able to block discussion.
Let's jump into it, because the topic of fossil fuel phase out is a pretty nuanced one, and it's got a storied history, and there's various permutations of how one would approach that declaration taking place in various different negotiating rooms around COP28. You've got phase down of fossil fuels, you've got phase out of fossil fuels, you've got phase out of unabated fossil fuels, and there's no doubt other flavours beyond that. Simon, do you want to just talk briefly to kind of what you're observing in terms of that conversation, how it's playing out around COP28?
Yeah, sure. So just to get a quick add in, Carbon Brief just published a piece last night where we get really into the details of all of this, looking at a bit of the history. Obviously unabated coal power was targeted in the Glasgow text a couple of years ago, but we kind of look into all of this debate. So in terms of where we are now in COP28, we've had two iterations of the text on the Stocktake. And the second, the first version just said, we might, it just had a bullet point. There'll be something about fossil fuels that we'll talk about. Then the second version had three separate options. And I would say, those options are not the last word on this. We'll definitely, I think even from day one, I've heard that certain parties have been putting forward different formulations. But just to run through those three options, option one is something like a just transition out of all fossil fuels. So no unabated, just kind of flat. But there's uncertainty over what a just transition actually means. And on phase out, it's very clear that people interpret that differently. So the out bit, to some people, that's very clearly to zero. And then actually coming back to Al Jabeer's comments, from his point of view, it doesn't. If it means zero, then that's not what the IPCC says. There's a non-zero amount of fossil fuels in 2050 in 1.5 pathways. So that already is unhelpful ambiguity. Often in COP text, it's helpful to have constructive ambiguity where people can interpret it as they wish.
Do you think in talking a little bit, in reading a little bit about the history of the language being introduced in COP text, abated versus unabated, and the fact that unabated was never properly really defined, do you think that's helpful ambiguity, or do you think that's going to come to a head here?
Again, I don't think it's helpful ambiguity in this case. So yeah, unabated appeared in Glasgow, and then subsequently during the approval session of the Working Group 3 of the IPCC's 6th assessment report. So this is the report on how to tackle climate change, basically. And that the approval session for the summary for policymakers means government representatives go through line by line and sign off the text. And apparently a party or parties were very keen during that session to insert the word unabated in front of any mention of fossil fuels. And so a group of authors, IPCC scientists, decided that immediately set up a need for a definition. And so they inserted a definition in a footnote of that report, which basically talks about, like, if it's abated, like you have to capture at least 90% of the emissions, and upstream emissions matter too, and you have to capture a lot of those. But in terms of the COP context, that's never been defined. And so if it's left undefined, it's kind of a free pass because people can interpret it how they wish. You know, you could say, like, if I've got a coal plant and I've got a CCS unit on it and it takes 10% of the emissions, then that's kind of abated, is it? I mean, it depends how you define it. So, yeah.
And so the area where the nuance becomes really difficult for people, because everyone's very worried about the way in which ambiguous terms might be used to smuggle in a bunch of bad stuff. If you look at the International Energy Agency's updated 1.5 degree pathway released recently, not the be-all, end-all, and significantly evolved from just 2 years ago and clearly going to evolve more, that has about an 80% roughly decline in total fossil energy use by 2050 versus 2022. 80% is not 100%. What's left in that? Well, there's a wedge of abated fossils, which is, I think, largely in that model gas electricity generation with CCS. There's a wedge of non-energy use of fossils for chemicals, basically, and there's a tiny little bit of unabated fossils in that. And so, like, what is that? That's something that annoys everybody, because it's not no fossils and it's not business as usual. An 80% decline in your business if you're a fossil producer is, like, pretty devastating, even if people pretend they'll be the last one standing, which everybody does pretend. So how does that very complex crystal ball view of what would be needed, how does that intersect with all these words? And everybody sees the worst in the words that are put forward by anybody but them.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned that pathway. We put a chart in our piece that I mentioned. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you can have all this debate about phase down, phase out, something, and all the other formulations of words that people could possibly come up with, talking about predominantly carbon-free energy systems by well before 2050, or whatever it is that people come up with. But ultimately, the important thing is that it looks something like those numbers. And the chart we showed is basically just a very, very steep decline in fossil fuels. I mean, maybe they should just call it that. You say, we agree there should be a very, very steep decline in fossil fuels in order to stay below 1.5.
We can have like brackets, square brackets around an extra set of verys.
Yeah.
Well, but that's a really good point, right? Because that reflects that there is some uncertainty about the exact mix of energy that we're going to land on. There's a range of different scenarios for how one might achieve that, and some 20, 25 years hence. And so, that's a reality. But I think that there's hard and fast views in different parts of the debate, and they're all fighting for their corner, right? It's a political conversation as much as it's a technical one.
And just one more thing about these iterations or permutations of text. One way that people, negotiators and co-chairs try and accommodate sometimes calls for harder language is to accept harder language into an option, but then add a softening modifier. So in this case, accelerating efforts towards a phase out of fossil fuels or unabated fossil fuels. What is accelerating efforts towards? It could be anything.
I'd say that's unhelpful ambiguity.
I mean, so yeah, I got sidetracked from the three options. So the first option was just phase out fossil fuels. The second option was what Tennant's just been talking about, accelerating efforts towards phasing out unabated fossil fuels. And I understand the EU's already said they're very unhappy about the accelerating towards. I mean, I think if you look at what happened in Glasgow, word salad is inevitable. Like some sort of, fossil fuels.
Get your tongs.
It's going to be in there, but there'll be some mess of verbs, adverbs, and adjectives and whatever. And then the third option, which is really important to mention, is on the table, no text. And that basically means some parties literally just don't want to talk about it at all. We heard, in the meeting last night where, there were several groups of countries basically said, we want to delete this entire paragraph that talks about the energy transition, not just fossil fuels, but also tripling renewables, doubling efficiency, the stuff about unabated coal, the stuff about fossil fuel subsidies. They just want to scrap it all. I mean, I don't think that will stand because others are too kind of strongly wedded to it. But, that's certainly being put forward by some people.
Since you raised it, let's get into like the other side of the coin, which is we're talking about the phase out of a certain sort of group of energy generation technologies. There's been a lot of hoopla around the fact that a whole bunch of nations, north of 100, have signed this global pledge for tripling deployment of renewable energy and doubling year-on-year improvement in energy efficiency by 2030, which was, again, one of those announcements that came fairly early in the COP to some great acclaim. These two conversations sort of go together. This is the happy, shiny part of the conversation. And then there's kind of like, a very messy boot of the car is like all the coal and gas and all that kind of stuff that needs to be worked through. But it's got to be a good thing. I think what I'm hearing around COP is like, well, it's great to have a pledge. There's a couple of things about these sorts of global pledges. There's a lot of them, and they're relatively easy to sign up to. Frankie and I were at a session with Dr. Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the IEA, a couple of days ago, who made the very point very strongly that there's not a lot of activity in terms of going and checking up on countries on whether they've followed through on any of these pledges at any point in the future.
I think when we were chatting about this the other day, I was recalling the global methane pledge, that was last year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Only a year ago,
only a year ago that we joined it.
We joined it. Yeah, that was Glasgow. Yeah, that was a Glasgow one.
If Australia's not in, is it really a global agreement?
Well, maybe 3 out of the 4 of us would say no. I don't know. But there hasn't been a whole lot of discussion since that pledge was announced on how countries are tracking to meet. It was a pretty ambitious commitment. It was a 30% reduction in methane on 2020 levels by 2030, which is not a BAU position for most of those countries to take forward, especially Australia. So, I think Fatty's point about needing effectively compliance, these countries need to be able to demonstrate they're actually putting in place policies that are going to deliver a tripling of renewables, a doubling of energy efficiency. These aren't easy things to do.
Well, and this is, his specific point was that it needs to be in the final text. And that's the thing that really counts, and that every nation that signed up to that pledge, if they're serious about it, should be doing their utmost to try and get it into the final text, because that becomes, the sort of the commitment that we all rally around and remember, and has some chance of being operationalised, right?
I mean, there's basically 2 reasons why it's important to see it, not only in this kind of sign-up pledge, which has got 118 countries or something, but also to see it in the final text. The first is about accountability, that checking up on progress. If it's in this UN legal text, people don't necessarily realise the stuff that comes out at the end of a COP. It's a legal agreement between all countries. So that's important. And then the second thing, which is really, really, really key, is that the whole point of the Stocktake is every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, we look up how we've been getting on. Newsflash, not so well. Then the next part of the Stocktake is to inform the next round of pledges, and those are due in 2025. And those will take, those targets will take countries out to 2035 or even to 2040. And so anything that is in this Stocktake text that's agreed at COP28, that is supposed to inform the next round of NDCs.
Yes.
So if there's something on fossil fuels in there, if there's something on tripling renewables and energy efficiency, countries are supposed to kind of somehow take that into account in their next NDCs. If it isn't in there, if it's just a sign-on pledge, They just go ahead and they do their pledges however they want.
Yeah, you are just a segue machine, Simon. Thanks for being on the show because we need to get into the global stocktake right now. We're not going to explain what the global stocktake is because we did that on the last episode of Let Me Sum Up. So appraise yourself of episode 38 if that's something you want to catch up on. But what we found here is that the global stocktake has kind of become the repository for a whole lot of thorny conversations that are not being canvassed in other parts of the negotiating process. Tennant, you've been sitting in on a bunch of negotiations. What have you observed?
Well, so it's got the thorny stuff that's not elsewhere, but it's also got the thorny stuff that is elsewhere. It's all the stuff.
It's basically the briar patch, isn't it?
There was a question asked in, I think, one of the briefings that we sat in around, like just how this works, where you've got the global stocktake, which is covering pretty much everything to some extent, and needing to sum it up, basically, happening concurrently with live negotiation streams, and just how does that work? And the answer is, it's very messy.
It is very messy. And there's like, to some extent, it's just mirroring and reflecting what is happening in those other streams. But also negotiators are sometimes having a little go at seeing if they can get somebody to concede something in the GST that their counterparts in other streams wouldn't concede, which they never do, but they have a go. Overall, these negotiations, like, they are being conducted in a good spirit, and I think they are going about as well as you could expect them to go, which is not all that well. They've got some text. It's got bajillions of options in it. I think.
Is that a technical term?
Yes. That's an SI bajillion. And in fact, technically, I think you will correct me. Would correct me in a moment, Simon, if I didn't say this. It's not even a text. It's a tool. It's something that the co-chairs of the negotiations, who are like morally superior superhumans, I cannot believe the work that they are doing from Singapore and the UK. But they have put together something that represents their best mind meld of what the parties all think, and they've put it forward, and the parties have said, oh, great work, and here's our surgical limited high priority additions, which went for 4.5 hours last night.
It was meant to be a half hour to an hour catch up.
Yeah, if surgery lasts 4.5 hours, you better be having a heart transplant.
Didn't you say someone had said there wasn't much left of the patient?
I did enjoy you traipsing off into the evening at about 6:45 yesterday evening, going, it's going to be a sharp hour, you know. Everything's going so well.
You've been coming to these things long enough to know that was never going to happen.
We'd also heard some real zingers from some of the countries at their earlier catch-up in the day.
Try-hard zingers,
was it the Canadian that said, yes, do androids dream of the GST or something?
What?
Like that? Oh,
you had to be there, Luke.
Really all drinking the GST Kool-Aid and having lots of weird in-jokes.
Yeah. Because like for all of these streams, like these are people who have spent like a long time together, and they have their clashes, but they're trying to get things done, and on a human level, there's a lot of camaraderie there. Generally, I don't know. There's a couple of delegates who I wonder, does anybody like you? Do you like anybody? Even at home, I don't know. But
that stings.
Yeah. Well, no names.
Come find Tennant around COP28 to find out who he's talking about.
or punish me. So anyway, I think GST is going well. I think that the top difficult issues are, what is the call to action on the next round of NDCs? What is that? Is that weak? Is it strong? Is it got the triple-double? Or is the triple-double going to be left on the menu at the Cheesecake Factory where we had dinner the other night for some insane reason, Frankie?
You loved every minute of that.
Yes,
Don't pretend otherwise.
It's true. It's that. It is the language about unilateral trade measures, which is a thing that developing countries are upset about, and mostly means EU CBAM, but there's some other things that they're worried about too. Is there going to be able to be any resolution there? I don't know. Don't get me started. Then...
finance?
Finance is like... It's there, but it's also mostly in its own stream.
Yeah.
Yeah, so finance is sort of semi-parked. I mean, we've already had on the first day the agreement on the loss and damage fund, which, I think surprised a lot of people, impressed a lot of people that they managed to get that done.
So early on as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that really changed the dynamics of the whole talks to an extent, because like last year, a lot of countries were pushing for fossil fuel language. They didn't get it and they were really upset, but they didn't want to upset the apple cart. They didn't want to make a big fuss over it because there was this agreement on the loss and damage fund, and that potentially lose that if they'd kicked off on fossil fuels. This year we've got the loss and damage fund agreed already,
yes,
as well as like a significant, if probably far too small contributions.
And this is the architecture for the loss and damage fund, a kind of an interim agreement. It's going to be housed at the World Bank for 4 years. Like, that's kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit. Say, well, that not everybody's happy with that, but they're happy enough for that to be where it lives for a little while.
Speaking of kicking the can down the road, while we speak, I'm informed that the GST contact group has been pushed back by another hour. Its second delay today.
Up to the minute news from Tennant Reid for this podcast that will be released in 2 days' time.
I'm sure it will have made a massive difference.
Timely, policy relevant podcast gold.
So that framework's been agreed. I think there are a lot of people surprised that was squared away so quickly. But as you say, while we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that have been committed, that is but a drop in the bucket in terms of what aspirations are for what would ultimately be housed within that fund, and that conversation is ongoing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think there's a decent amount of goodwill, although perhaps that's a little bit nuanced. I heard a negotiator from AOSIS, so like small island states, saying they were basically a bit pissed off by this impression that some parties were giving, they ought to be grateful. Hey guys, you've got your loss and damage fund, there's some money in it. Now basically just go home and go away. And that was the impression he gave. And I think they were pretty unimpressed with that kind of vibe, because there's a lot of other things on the table that they're interested in. There's stuff like the global goal on adaptation, which seems to be really struggling here. A lot of that is around the fact that it's just, there just isn't good information. So it's quite hard to have targets for something where it's so ill-defined. But also there's, that's like a kind of proxy fight around what's called means of implementation, which basically means money. So there's a target in the text as it stands at the draft text at the moment, calling for 400 billion a year just in adaptation finance. Bearing in mind we may or may not have reached the 100 billion a year in climate finance overall. So that's obviously like a pretty wild number. And then there's, finance kind of bubbles up all over the place.
Well, since we mentioned adaptation, I did want to note that also while we're chatting, it's Buildings Day. Well, it's Urbanisation Cities Buildings Day here at COP28, and I've just come from a plenary session with the UN high-level champion for COP28, and they were talking about the fact that we need, multi-level. It's a lot. If you work in the built environment like I do, policy solutions in this space are not simple. It's an incredibly fragmented sector with stakeholders, but the governance is very much split. It's not, by and large, controlled or managed by nation states, sub-nations. State level governments, cities, councils hold a lot of the levers. So a lot of the discussion this morning was around how do we empower those different levels of government, and it actually went straight to the point of finance and the money to make sure that the funds, not just for mitigation but for adaptation, which are significant in a sort of infrastructure built environment context, need to get down to those levels. And how are we going to achieve that? I'm wanting to follow more of the global goal and adaptation discussions here for the rest of the week, because it's really fraught. Like, it's just an area of policy that is far less developed. There's been far less focus on this.
Yep.
Like, in some respects, understandably, because, you want to be focused on mitigating and, making sure that we're not burning fossil fuels, being dug out of the ground and making the problem worse. But as we sit here in 2023, scheduled to be the hottest year on record, we're living with a level of climate change now. Anyone listening to this back in Australia has recent memories of horrific natural disasters over the last few years. And if we do our absolute very best to get back onto a trajectory for 1.5 degrees, we're at least locked in with the sorts of things that we're seeing already out to 2050. So, like, this is the new normal. And if you think about how much it would cost to future-proof homes so that they're not going to be destroyed by every flood that happens every couple of years, or you're not going to bake inside your own house, it's a huge amount of money.
And there's a nexus there, right, between the mitigation and adaptation programs around things like, thermal performance of homes, which has a mitigation benefit in energy systems that remain dominated by fossil fuels, at least for the next few years, as well as kind of ensuring that we are protecting humans from those increasingly regular extreme weather events. So I think that's something that is worth bearing in mind. And just it does seem like there's just a power of work to sort of think about how to characterise what we're trying to achieve in adaptation, given all of these many and various contexts. What are we measuring to sort of understand how we're improving over time? There is no sort of pithy tripling renewables for adaptation. It just doesn't exist. So how do you even communicate that from a political perspective as well?
And in many respects, you're having to you're projecting into the future. And so what are we investing or adapting for?
Yep.
The pathways are many and varied from here on out, depending on different scenarios that you look at.
And there's complications. I mean, maybe things are harder in some ways here in negotiations than they are in implementation land back home. Maybe they're harder in other ways in implementation land. But when adaptation-related issues have been raised in the GST, I've heard some developing country parties push back very strongly against the idea of maladaptation, that adaptation can be done badly and raise emissions in the process. They're very sensitive, some countries, about that idea because they see it as pushing them further on how they're prepared to do mitigation. I've also heard some developing country parties push back against the idea that there are limits to what we can adapt to, which on the one hand you can defend that view as, well, let's not give up, let's not consign anybody to, or you're just doomed to move or die. But also, like, there are limits to what we can adapt to, and going as if, well, if there's just sufficient provision of resources, we'll be fine. I think we probably need a view of the cliff that we're heading towards.
It doesn't survive contact with reality. When you think about the scale of the challenge of the work that would need to be done across not just developing countries, the scale of the work that would need to be done to adapt our cities and places where everyone lives, and the infrastructure that we all rely on for access to food, water, security, housing. It's hard to overstate how much of a funding challenge that would be when you're also competing for funding for mitigation efforts, right? This isn't happening in a silo.
Yeah. I should add, there are definitely questionable and eyebrow-raising things that developed country parties say at these things too.
Well, one thing I think we can say about adaptation is we know the regularity in which we're dealing with extreme weather events is going to ratchet up over the next decade or so. So I think something we can predict is that in future COPs over the next few years, this is just going to keep going up and up and up the agenda. And so, that could be for the good, or it could be a bit of a chaos element in the negotiations as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a few interesting things that all that makes me think about. I mean, you talked about 2023 being the hottest year on record. Just a note of information on the negotiations. There's a track which is specifically about the science. Mm-hmm. And people might remember, if they were tracking the COP24 negotiations in 2018, 2019, there was this huge blow up about whether to welcome the IPCC's work on 1.5 and whether they were going to welcome it in quotes or whether they could only quotes note the report. And there's a little bit of a kind of repeat of that at the moment. There's a fight over whether to welcome the recent work of the World Meteorological Organization, and also a fight over whether it's speculative to say that 2023 is on track to be the warmest year on record, which is, again, something that the WMO has said it's virtually certain, like more than 99% certain that this year will be the hottest.
So you're saying there's a chance?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that there's an interesting relationship in the negotiations between the scientific evidence and what people say, and I think that applies to the whole argument about maladaptation, limits to adaptation as well, which was featured pretty strongly as a real issue in the IPCC's report. Just on like kind of stepping back from the negotiations, we've got like all these different fights that are popping up. There's small, sort of less prominent negotiating tracks around just transition and response measures, which is about how basically how fossil fuel producers are affected by climate policy. Both of those tracks seem to be a little bit rocky, to put it mildly. But thinking ahead kind of into next week, what are going to be the things in the final plenary whether they're fighting about? Last year it was fossil fuels and versus like mitigation and the loss and damage fund. This year we're clearly going to have the fossil fuel fight. Finance is always in that mix, but perhaps this year more via adaptation than previous years. And then obviously, like underlying all of this stuff is equity. Basically whose fault is it, and how much do we say about that?
Right, it is time for one more thing. We will share something that is currently captivating our attention here at COP28. Tennant, what have you got?
There's no surprises here.
Strap in.
Does it begin with C?
It does. It does indeed. So CBAM is...
You didn't even actually need to say it. I feel like you should have just launched into your piece.
Well, I want to be open to new listeners who don't know me.
Well, you should unpack that acronym then, Tennant.
Carbon border adjustment mechanisms, specifically the one that the European Union is in the process of implementing, are a big deal. They're a big deal outside these negotiations where some significant economies are reconciling themselves effectively to the reality of CBAM. But it's a big deal within the negotiations. There was part of how a big fight about the agenda was avoided at the outset of this COP was agreement that complaints about unilateral trade measures would be previously resisted being heard anywhere. They were tried to be raised in the Forum on Response Measures last year, and that was rejected. They've been parked in the GST as the place to have the fight. And the fight is developing countries think that these things, CBAM and other green industrial policy and US solar tariffs and whatever, that these things harm developing countries and they ought to be stopped. And therefore they're trying in a consensus-based process where everybody has to agree everything pretty much to get developed countries to agree that they won't do them, which is obviously not going to happen. But it's an important element. The thing that I want to highlight, though, is there's some work out there that has been influential on the thinking of developing country parties here and at home on what these impacts might be. There's a particular study that a school within the London School of Economics did for the African Climate Foundation, which has been interpreted as saying that EU CBAM will reduce African countries' GDP by a collective $25 billion a year.
You talked about this a few months ago. You said it was rubbish.
It was then and it is now rubbish, but I clearly need to talk to a lot more people here and direct them to my LinkedIn post, which will be in the show notes. Because there's a lot of bad modelling exercises out there. This is one of them. And no, EU CBAM will not reduce African nations' GDP by $25 billion US, for a whole bunch of reasons that I won't go into now. I do think that there needs to be some ongoing dialogue at future COPs about this intersection of trade and climate. There's been this very unenlightening, it's his problem, it's their problem kind of thing between the UNFCCC and the WTO about this. And I really hope we can come to the end of that, not have demarcation fights and developed country parties pretending not to know what unilateralism means. And just have a discussion, because we would learn more and get more comfortable if we could actually talk about what is really going on. So that's me.
Great. Frankie, what have you got?
Apart from my suggestion yesterday to Tennant that when I resume my duties as a T-shirt maven for the Letting Some Up podcast, I should make one. I should make 2 T-shirts for you and me, Luke, that says "I'm with CBAM guy" and an arrow. And when the 3 of us are together, we wear it around with Tennant.
I think that the entire Australian delegation could potentially make use of those T-shirts.
And an alternate design could say, "Don't ask Tennant about CBAM."
That's not my one more thing, but right. I had to sneak it in. I wanted to note a couple of things I think that Australians back at home might be interested to know about our involvement in the negotiations moving forward, and just a couple of items of interest. So we talked for a little while here about adaptation. It's worth noting that our very own Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Jenny McAllister, will be co-chairing the decision text on adaptation when the ministers take over next week in a couple of days. So that's going to be, I think, probably a challenging role, but that's a great recognition of Australia that she's been given that opportunity to co-chair.
Perfectly placed to bring the adaptation and energy efficiency agendas together.
Absolutely. And my sneaky twofer is about Australia's prospects.
I think that's a threefer, by the way.
Fine. Well,
you're tripling up.
The T-shirt one doesn't count.
Oh, okay.
I want to put a little pin on Australia's prospects at hosting COP31 in 2026. I think we all came here with high hopes that would be finalised and maybe being in a position to be announced, and it feels like we're probably not in that position. Not because maybe we're not a strong chance against the other party bidding, which is Turkey, but that there's some uncertainty over where COP is going to be next year. And I think, the point was made, it's sort of hard to focus on a COP in, 3 years' time when next year's one isn't certain.
If anybody listening has a spare shed or a living room that could accommodate 80,000 people and is unbooked for next year, then, come forward.
Yeah.
Well, this is the trick, right? Like, we're in a pretty remarkable situation where due to, a fractious environment, which may be related to Russia in the Eastern European bloc.
Which is where it was meant to be next year.
100%. Like, it's a consensus process, and there is not much consensus in that part of the world at the moment. So we don't know where COP29 is going to be, which the most likely scenario seems to be it's just going to revert back to Bonn, right? We think COP30 is going to be in Brazil, but we don't yet have a city confirmed.
I believe it's meant to be Belém.
Belém.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is in the middle of the Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah. But has that been officially?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, that's just the word around the traps. And then obviously, the contention that you refer to, Frankie, which, as we understand it, is being worked through, but between Turkey and Australia means that we also don't have a landing point for COP31. So a bit of uncertainty in terms of the future trajectory of COPs over the next 3 years.
Yes, and maybe just the last thing to say there is if Australia is successful, we should, where's it going to be in Australia? I think recent events in Australia, it's interesting to think about. Brisbane's got the Olympics. Maybe they don't want an extra thing to deal with there on the way through. Melbourne pulled out of...
the Lord Mayor of Brisbane was very keen last year.
He was. And I don't know if Adrian Trina listens to this podcast, so it may correct the record on that. So it would be interesting to know if they're still interested. Melbourne pulled out of the Commonwealth Game, or Victoria pulled out of the Commonwealth Games, so I don't know if that's a possibility. So is it Sydney? The Adelaide?
I think
we'll see.
Reflecting on just the way COPs are growing, I think the most material question is where in Australia could actually host an event of this scale.
Yes. Infrastructure first, symbolism distant second.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Simon.
Well, you've all provided a beautiful segue, because this was my one other thing was to talk about the host for next year, COP29. You already mentioned it was meant to be in Eastern Europe, and that's like a defined list of countries, many of which are within the EU. Russia is apparently vetoing any EU country for reasons that are quite hard to fathom, but perhaps you can guess.
Yep.
So they don't want an EU country to be the host. That already kind of crosses off a long list of the potential hosts. A bunch of other potential hosts in the Eastern European region are basically war zones. So that's like at least another 2 or 3 countries crossed off. And then we get onto like the logistics point, which is, a lot of those are quite small countries, places like Montenegro. It's expensive and you need a really big space, big conference space. In the UK, when we hosted COP26, there were literally really only 3 places it could be: Glasgow, Birmingham and London. And, we ended up in Glasgow, and even that venue was basically way too small. So that's like a big consideration. I was looking into the rules of procedure, which actually haven't ever been formally adopted. So ever since the COP process began, they drew up these rules of procedure, and then there's a bit in there about voting, but no one could agree whether to agree that they would have votes where there wasn't agreement. So now they just have to do everything by consensus. But basically everything else applies until they until they come up with something else. And the rules of procedure basically say if there isn't a host, it defaults to the seat of the Secretariat, which is Bonn. I've had a few people saying they think it can be anywhere in Germany. I think that the wording basically suggests if they come up with a creative solution, and if all the parties agree here at COP28, then it probably could be somewhere else in Germany. And then on the presidency point, basically the president gets appointed. So Sultan Al Jaber was appointed at the start of COP28. If no other president is appointed at COP29, then Al Jaber continues in that role.
Wow.
So he could be in place. However, I have heard...
Noted popular president of COP, Sultan Al Jaber.
I think it's pretty clear that parties don't want either of those things to happen, for it to be in Bonn because it's not big enough, or for Al Jaber to be the president. The UAE have already said they don't want to host it again. But the hot tip I'm hearing is Moldova. Whether they would have the facilities to host it in country, or whether it would be some kind of creative solution like we had. The Chile COP was actually in Madrid, for example. So there's ways around it. I'm sure they'll come up with something.
Okay. If Moldova could host in Madrid again, the Spaniards did an incredible job of putting on. They had 6 weeks' notice or so. You wouldn't have known. The logistics were as smooth as silk.
All right, hot tip. There you go. That's why you invite a journalist onto the pod. Hey. I just wanted to do a big shout out to our friends at the Australia Pavilion, who are putting on a remarkable show. The renowned coffee at the Australia Pavilion, the reputation that was established back at COP27 in Sharm is being carried forward with gusto. It continues to be excellent coffee, and there's an awful lot of work going on. I think it's a more diverse program at the Australia Pavilion this year. It's really heartening to see a really strong engagement, both with Indigenous Australians, but really importantly our Pacific Island neighbours, who are being real. Like it feels like they're real, like we've created a real space for them, and they feel it feels like that sense of a region coming together
Almost as if Australia's punting for hosting the COP in a few years' time.
And that's important to point out. This is no accident, right? This is something that is very deliberate, but there's a great feeling around the place, and it's really nice to have that diversity of perspectives around the pavilion. It's something that I've really enjoyed over the last few days. So shout out to the team at the OzPav. All right, well that's a podcast, I think. We're on all socials. Where can people find you, Simon? People have heard ad nauseum where to find us, which is various places in the increasingly fragmented social media landscape.
I mean, the same applies. I mean, I guess our website is the first port of call, just calmbrief.org.
Yep.
I'm sure you could put the piece I mentioned in the show notes,
yep.
And people can still follow me on Twitter, whatever we're calling it these days. I have forayed into LinkedIn and other places, but to be honest, for all of its problems, and it's pretty much a hell site these days, Twitter is still incredibly useful. So I will be continuing to tweet about the summit as it goes on.
Continuing to fly the flag on X, a brave man indeed. All right, well, Tennant, we have an email address. What is it?
It is mailbag@letmesumup.net. And you should send all your suggestions for papers we should cover and thoughts on papers we did cover to that address.
Because that's what we normally do. We don't normally talk about COP. We normally talk about papers and sum them up.
Papers.
All right. And Frankie, we have a website. What's there?
We do. Our entire delightful back catalogue of musings on various all and sundry on climate and energy. So go to letmesumup.net. And you can find this fantastic episode and every other one before that and future episodes to come right there for your delight.
Fantastic. All right. Well, for Frankie Muscovich, Tennant Reid, Dr. Simon Evans and Baby Muscovich, which, can I say, has done a sterling job over the course of this podcast, I'm Luke Benzel. Thanks for listening and we'll talk to you again soon.